Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the newest episode of Finders Keepers. This is in association with Getman's Virtual Fairs, as well as produced by Full Moon Films. I'm your host, Brian Chittister, and this episode is in association with the Greenwich Village Antiquarian Book Fair. The address to get to the virtual fair is at the bottom, and we're doing it again virtually because of COVID. So hopefully the live fair will be back again next year, but many, if not all, the same great dealers are exhibiting at the virtual fair, and it's one of my favorites because you just have so many incredible collectors and weird subjects that sort of get brought out of the woodwork for this particular fair. And I think this particular speaker that we have today, Nina Antonia, is a good fit for the Greenwich Village Fair because her work has some association with the punk movement, and particularly one of New York's kind of proto-punk or glam meets punk groups, the New York Dolls. And her first book was about one of the New York Dolls, Johnny Thunders. And so we're going to jump right in, but I just really very enthused to have Nina Antonia here, and who I think, as I've read through her work and gotten more excited about it over the years, the best way I can describe it is nonfiction meets magic realism. There's something very otherworldly about her figures, that where their sort of decadence ends is where this, there's an opening up into something very transcendent about her work, and I really love how she explores that. And so, hi Nina, sorry for the long introduction, but
no, fine. I was just listening to it. and thinking how wonderful the antiquarian book fair sounded.
When I read your essay on Oscar Wilde and the Purple Thread, it was definitely a different take than I had ever seen on Wilde. Very unacademic, but at the same time, like, it was just perfumed with all this mystery. And I wonder, because I saw elsewhere online where some different writers and journalists and people that have interviewed you or reviewed your books have said that you have this kind of obsession with fate. And it does seem that a lot of your characters, whether it's Lionel Johnson or the Los Angeles glam artist Brett Smiley or Johnny Thunders or Oscar Wilde, all have sort of brushed up against the inevitable. And I wonder if you could talk about, is that a conscious thing on your part, or are you just sort of drawn to characters who are, I don't know, for lack of a better word, fly too close to the flame?
Well, I mean, I had a novel published 3 years ago, The Greenwood Faun, and it sort of asked this very question at the beginning, and I tried to answer it by saying that I think that artists that try and transcend mortal bounds, it's a bit like magic. If you put too much of yourself on the page, if it's too much of your soul, so to speak, I think you can sort of get into rather difficult territory, difficult terrain. You can wander out too far from the shore of what we know is sanity.
As a writer, do you sort of take a sort of an opposite approach of your subjects, and maybe try to be objective and maybe a little bit more hesitant, or do you find that you sort of go headlong into them with the same kind of reckless abandon? I mean, what's your relationship?
Yes. I don't hold back at all, and when I write something, it usually comes from some great passion that blows in from somewhere, and then once I've written it, it's done with. I've sort of played the part, which is to give that artist some longevity on paper.
Have you ever sort of stepped back and maybe analyzed what draws you to the characters that you write about?
Only in sort of very obvious ways that I'm not particularly interested in the mainstream, which I think for the most part is like McDonald's for the brain or something. It's mulch. It has its place, but in a book that I was reading recently, I'm still reading, it's very good. It's called Trickster, and it's by a chap called George P. Hansen. And he asks the question that why is the supernatural or miracles or any of it, why is it always sidelined or maligned? And I think for certain types of people or scientific people, they can't see it existing on the same planet as them. And I don't think that's quite right, because these things do exist. And one of the quotes that I found in this particular book was that rationalization destroys enchantment, and we're in a particularly dreadful time for rationalization. And I do wonder, with everything about science, we have to have science, it's important, but if science was that great, why isn't it dealing with climate change?
Right. Well, I mean, I don't know. In my own answer, it feels like the rise of the alt-right has given the mainstream media and scientific positivists and secularists sort of open season on anybody who has spiritual proclivities or is the least bit interested in something that's esoteric. Certainly,
but I was going to say, even before What's Blown Up, I think that was the case, but perhaps it was quieter.
I saw it after 9/11 and the Middle East wars. You had kind of underground artists like the Flaming Lips doing albums called At War with the Mystics in the early 2000s. And it did seem like there was this kind of, I don't know, academic hegemony of secularism and scientific positivism, where there just was no room for anything spiritual, and anything spiritual was sort of suspect. But then
yes, I know. Go on. It's very interesting how the spiritual has now become the suspect, unless it's within the format of Wicca, which is very fashionable.
Yeah, well, I would say that around 2011, when Occupy Wall Street was happening here in New York, the trust of the establishment on both sides, at least in American politics, was at an all-time low. And I started seeing a lot of pyramids and third eyes and, tarot paraphernalia and things like that, just becoming a part of the counterculture, really. And it seemed like, for me, for as long as
Sorry, it's been part of the counterculture since the 1960s, though. All of those things. They're just pulling back old symbols that were used to sort of as decor in the age of Aquarius.
Yeah, so I guess in a way it sort of cyclically started bubbling up again, but that was just my impression. The hostility from academia and from mainstream media sources towards spirituality remained sort of unmoved during all that time. But I think you're seeing a lot more interest in esoterica now, at least in films and television. There's a lot more literature out there. I don't quite know what to attribute it to, other than, like I said, I think there's just a general mistrust of the establishment, and maybe esoteric spiritual forms are just something that have remained sort of available but never really homogenized. I don't know.
Well, they can't homogenize. That's the point about them. And also, perhaps people become more interested in esoteric subjects when aspects of real life become very unpalatable or upsetting, because, I mean, obviously I'm English, so I have a different take on it.
Right.
But the age of Aquarius and a lot of American esoteric interest came up at the same time as the Vietnam War. So it may be, and also, more than anything, all of us, no matter where we live, have become terribly cut off from nature, and we're part of nature. And I was just thinking about a street that I used to like walking down, and it's in a place called Twickenham, and it used to be quite leafy, and they gentrified it. And the gentrification means white concrete, and there's lots of glass and aluminium and steel, and they got rid of all the trees. So it's absolute burning hell when you walk down there in the summer. And where is the logic, unless they want to willingly make people ill, that even at this crisis point, designers, architects, councils are not pulling back on this kind of madness? And it makes, I think it makes very healthy societies as well.
Well, since you wrote about Lionel Johnson, and since Arthur Machen had an influence on your novel that you mentioned, Greenwood Faun, maybe you can talk a little bit about, from your point of view, how the loss of nature in the sort of post-industrial age has fed into this subculture of literature that we call folk horror, supernatural horror, things like that.
I do think that it's all part of that, and come what may, though we still hear the call of the seasons, and I don't know, we still need nature to be healthy, to breathe, and until we come back into balance, then the world will go up in flames, which is what's happening now. We're being told so loud and clear. And I didn't mean to go off on this tangent because it makes it sound like I write about this, but I'm more interested in life's mysteries. I mean, I've seen some strange things, inexplicable things, and I mentioned them to somebody that was very religious, and he sort of said, well, they're quite standard visions as far as these things go. So they weren't as obscure as I thought, which I found quite comforting. But there's probably some people that would watch this and nudge and sideline me even more. But my books are very readable.
Yeah, no, you write really clearly and evocatively. Did you always want to be a writer?
Pretty much, yes. I did some backing vocals once for someone, and Wikipedia got hold of it and gave me a whole career as a singer. But no, I always wanted to be a writer. People that don't know you or understand you, if you're a bit of a cult figure, they tend to attempt to mold you in different directions. But I did always want to be a writer. Yeah.
You describe yourself as a cult figure?
Yeah.
Why?
Would you not agree with that?
I would say that your work is outside the mainstream, if that's what a cult figure is, but it's, I don't know, widely available, and there seems to be almost universal praise for the approach. So I don't know what the...
But this never opens the door to me, which I find very, very interesting. But I'm also pleased that I've managed to keep getting my work published, which is the most important thing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm more interested not in how you're critically perceived or whether there's a category in which to put your work into. I'm more interested in sort of the topography of characters and the ecology, and how you populate your world as a writer. I'm also a nonfiction, a curator and an art historian myself. So I'm using existing figures, existing artifacts, existing thoughts and stories to then build out. And I just find the way that you put together your worlds, it's very different. And once I started reading one thing, I sort of just kept staying in, just following it up with another one of your books. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm really more interested in your process and how you find these subjects, and also because you're not going for the Shakespeare or the Milton or the, you know, even the Ramones or whatever. I mean, you're finding these figures who are more along, you know, in the margins, but who had these incredibly salient worlds that they had built through their music or their art. And in a way, you're kind of being...
Why they've built these beautiful universes that are like separate planets of wonder, and not everybody gets to visit them. But it's also, I think, as I said to you, I don't find mass success of being particularly interesting, and the people that you do meet are, when they're very successful, usually seem to be a little bit, I don't know, disconnected. The story is more, it's what happens to people and how they are thrown about by life, how they cope with that, how they may still be continuing with their art. I mean, you could say that Oscar Wilde wrote his best material when he came out of prison. There's things that are born out of suffering tend to have a more pure voice, a more resonant voice than things that are just born out of the machinery of fashion or ego.
How would you say that applies to you as a writer?
I am quite shy. I am not somebody that goes out Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday when we were able to. I'm very bookish, and despite the pictures of me with Johnny Sanders, where we look like the ultimate rock and rollers, I mean, I wasn't one to grab a bottle of Jack Daniels and dance around at the bottom of the stage. I was more interested in Johnny as this sort of, I don't know, the James Dean of rock and roll. He was clearly in a lot of pain, and yet he was also an absolutely riveting performer. So he was very much sort of on the high wire of life, but also he was very honest. It makes me think of Nico in Manchester as well. It's like, how on earth do these wonderful creatures end up in these circumstances? That interests me as well.
Yeah, I'm sort of curious how the Johnny Thunders book came about. It was published in 1987, is that correct?
Yes. But it came about through, I had a lovely collection of rejection slips, including one from the NME, because I wrote to them for advice. And they wrote back, Neil Spencer, the editor, wrote back saying that, why was I writing about Johnny Thunders? Why didn't I put my energy into something else? That the staff at the NME all found Johnny's writing wanting. And of course, that made me want, every rejection only made me feel stronger that I have to get this book out, because I know that there are people that want to read about him. I mean, Johnny had a huge and dedicated following, whether the establishment or the newspapers or whatever were aware of it, well, that's their loss.
What was the reception in 1987 for punk and books or content about punk?
Well, there was a lot less music books anyway, but you know, well, there was one thing that happened to me, was that I approached Virgin Records and Books. They published a lot of books, and somebody wrote back and said, yes, we'll have a meeting. So I was really broke. I was living up in Manchester, and I was a single mum, and I was really excited because I thought that meant that they wanted to publish the book. So I sold a lot of albums to get the coach fare. I couldn't even afford the train at that point, and went to the meeting at the very plush offices of Virgin in Portobello. And the guy there said, he looked at my writing and said, well, I can see that you can write, but why are you writing about Johnny Thunders? And he gave me a lecture about, he didn't see that there was any future in writing about punk. He didn't see that there would be a punk book market, and he pulled down a few books off the shelf that were doing well at that point, and one was about Lionel Richie, the other was about Frankie Goes to Hollywood. Now, I mean, they were fun, Frankie Goes to Hollywood, but anyway, on the subject of punk, he felt that there was nothing, he had no vision, this guy, and he said the only punk book that they were going to do was this Sid Vicious book. So I left there really distraught and very upset that I sold my albums for this. But on the other hand, it made me feel like this was this campaign that I had somehow had to fulfill, and I was very persistent, and although I felt the pain. And then what happened was that Jungle Records in London started releasing some of Johnny's records, and I got in touch with them and sent them some chapters, and they thought it would be a good idea to release it as a way of promoting Johnny. So they published it, and it started to sort of get acclaim. And I remember that it was reviewed in Record Collector. It was very funny because it was sandwiched between a book on Wham and a book on Madonna, and the reviewer going, oh, this is interesting. Somebody's written about Johnny Thunders. They're actually quite kind to it. And so it sold, and it sold in Japan, but it never hit a wider audience, unfortunately, until Johnny died. And then it started being referenced. And then it transpired that there was a new audience for it. So an updated version came out, and it's been sort of still weaving it, still asking me about it. And please God, it should be reissued on paper again, because it's available on Kindle, but it will be reissued on paper with lots of beautiful photographs, which is what Johnny always wanted, here and in Japan.
So after the Johnny Thunders book in 1987, there's a long gap for you before another book comes out. Can you tell me what was going on in that time as far as, you know, your creative interests?
Well, I did write a book about the only ones, the one and only, which is about Peter Perrett, who's another mythical figure. And I think Johnny introduced me to Peter, and I really liked him. And I always thought of them as being like, Johnny was like Rimbaud, the French poet, and Peter was like Baudelaire for his beautiful cynicism. Mm-hmm. So that kind of made a sense to me. And I really didn't care if these books were mass sellers. I just wanted to write books about great characters. And I was also had an awareness, which was a bit strange, of time passing, an acute awareness, and that you had to catch something before it just all slid away.
Were there subjects that you wanted to write about that you didn't have the opportunity?
Yes, I really wanted to write about Nico, and at that point in time, I couldn't get a publishing deal. Somebody kept me waiting 6 or 7 months. I mean, it was absolutely ridiculous. I'm glad to see that a woman has issued a book now, and what is refreshing is she's done it post the Velvet Underground, because Nico had a long solo career. So
yeah.
I have written long notes, and there's some stuff up on my website, some interviews relating to her. So
you wrote a list of books that online that you read or recommend, and it was
the Shepherd list.
What's that?
Was it for it's a website called Shepherd?
I think so. It was a really intriguing list. I loved the books you chose and the write-ups of why you chose them. And I'm wondering, do you collect anything?
No, I mean, well, actually, I've got a lot of books on sort of folklore, and I do like a bit of pixie lore and things like that, yes. So liminal things, and I think if I had more money, I would get more books that Philippe Julian had illustrated. I've got one Furbank book here that's beautiful that he illustrated. But it's as eclectic as that list, although we were only allowed to choose 5 books. So it was really difficult. You know, I was sort of sitting there thinking, well, shall I put Our Lady of the Flowers or John Reschi's City of Night? But then I thought, well, Jean Genet's Our Lady of the Flowers has always been quite important. And that's quite important because that has those aspects of very faded glamour and very marginalized characters. It sort of does exist like a very tarnished fairy story, and it's very daring for when it was written. And for me, it makes as much sense sort of then sort of segueing into The Hill of Dreams, which is Arthur Machen's book, which is perhaps the book that's had the most profound effect on me, I think, which is if that came out at the same time as The Picture of Dorian Gray, but it's usually left off the sort of classic decadent text, but it is very decadent, and it's about a young country boy who has a vision of some sort of pagan ceremony, and he believes he can capture the love of his life if he goes to London to write a book about it. And Arthur Machen writes in a way that truly is transcendent. Everything can vanish and rebuild in moments. I don't know how he does it. He was a real conjurer with words. And that's something that comes up in the Oscar Wilde book. But Machen is interesting because he was a member of the Golden Dawn. And I think that's why he may have been able to protect himself better from opening himself up to sort of psychic forces. But anyway, the young character in The Hill of Dreams goes to London to write his book of visions, and he starts taking mysterious elixir. And I think it says he goes out for a walk late at night, and all of London has turned into some sort of terrifying Bacchic ritual. And he goes back to his lonely room and sort of morphs into a latter-day Chatterton. You know that Henry Wallace picture of Chatterton? He's imagined Chatterton, the boy poet, that couldn't get published either, I don't think. He wrote a forgery, that was it. And he accidentally took an overdose, I think it was of strychnine. So he's shown lying across a bed with this absolutely flamingly beautiful red hair. And on the floor are all his torn up notes. Just more literary rejection, but he's all of 17. And in a sense, Machen brings this to life. And he was a great night walker. And he said what would happen. He wanted to write a book about what happened to somebody who just basically got lost while still living their life. And that's what happens in The Hill of Dreams. The young author, Lucian, just sort of wanders into his vision and can't be pulled back, and there is no book. So the Greenwood Faun follows on from that. You don't have to have read The Hill of Dreams, but it's about what happened to Lucian's lost manuscript and the effect that it has on people once they get hold of it, and the sort of beautiful madness that then ensues in Victorian London.
It's really fascinating to hear you talk, because I can feel that in a way you're sort of drawn to this, you know, mystery of the secret societies or the, you know, those organizations, and at the same time glamour and decadence and their nearness to tragedy and mystery and transcendence. And I'm sort of curious as like how much more conscious that has become in your work of all of sort of the interrelationship between them. Because I know that you also wrote an essay on Yeats and on his interest in Irish fairies.
Swan River. And they did an anthology of essays dedicated to Yeats, who I thought was far more interesting than that other sort of consignee to the Golden Dawn, Aleister Crowley. But yes, I wanted to write about Yeats' relationship with the fairies and how he saw them. And I also did another essay for the same publisher called Away, which is very interested about how people believe that there were two ways in which fairies kidnapped people. Do you know anything about this?
No.
Okay, so there was sincere and an absolute belief, particularly in Ireland, but in Scotland too, that if you were not mindful of your children or placed iron on the wall or whatever, then the pixies or fairies would steal your baby. And I think there's a few cases of people really believe this, and sadly it led to some incidences of child cruelty. But I was interested in, well, what would the person stolen by the fairies feel? Because they also took young women, young brides usually. And one of my favorite of Yeats' poem is one called The Hosts of the Earth. And it's about a newlywed who is spirited away. And yet somehow, even while she's being spirited away, she tells her husband not to share the spirit's food. Once you eat fairy food, then you can't go back to mortal ways. So it's really very interesting. So I wrote a short story about a young man that trespasses on a grove belonging to the fairies.
I was reading in Hellbore an interview with Alan Moore, the writer of Watchmen and many, many other books and graphic novels and whatnot. And he brings up this idea that, you know, Syd Barrett and maybe other figures who went mad had an encounter with the fairies or with Pan or with some sort of wild god or wild folkloric figure who, their mind was not prepared for that encounter. And so when it happened, it's possible that they went mad, but it's just as possible that what they experienced made them simply unfit for this world and not necessarily.
I would agree with that. Ironically, there's some footage of Alan Moore in the area where I live, because I live in one of the last villages in London, and there's a sort of funny, I suppose, pyramid shape between where the famous court conjurer John Dee is buried, and then you have the corner of the common where there's a statue to Mort Bolan, and then further around you've got the explorer Richard Burton's crypt. So it is an area of odd energy, but I think that's what you're saying about Alan Moore's idea. I think that's probably very true. You're not supposed to see. We're not supposed to see with visionaries' eyes anymore.
Why do you think that is?
Because I think it goes back to the marginalization of anything sort of supernatural or miraculous. I just think people are frightened and they can't admit it, and they may never come close to feeling or seeing anything like that. I remember, sadly, when the pandemic began, people were being really cool of the fact that Lord's had to close, And regardless of religion, why would you mock a place that brings hope to people that are terribly ill? Because you must be scared on some level. You don't want to think that actually maybe there are miracles, or, you know, I do believe if there are nature spirits, as in the little people, they're probably one of the first things that we damned to extinction.
Yeah. I had an experience of encountering Pan when I was maybe 4 or 5 years old in my Aunt Florence's garden. She had built a labyrinth with shrubs that had grown in her yard that was difficult to get out of once you went inside of it. And it had a lot of fragrant smells because it was brushed up against the mulberry grove and also some honeysuckle. And I remember getting lost in there at one point and feeling like there was a spirit that was around me, or a being that was around me, that was basically sort of removing my memory. And it was terrifying, but it was also kind of thrilling. And I remember after getting totally frightened by the experience of not knowing where I was, and not even being able to retrace my steps, suddenly feeling a very warm and comfortable feeling at having been, even at that early age, already removing some of the, civilized ways of thinking. And I felt totally mad and totally wild in that moment. And it was exhilarating, and it really stayed with me for a long time, and kind of came back up later in my teenage years. I remembered it very strongly and could almost sort of be transported back there into that feeling. But I wonder.
That's probably in all of this stuff. I think it's. I mean, I've seen and experienced two. Well, I won't go into all of them, but I mean, one evening early evening. I was walking with a friend somewhere, and I was absolutely sane and sober. And I walked past a church, and it was. I later found out it was the church where people that were being taken to Tyburn to be hung would stop off there for a glass of whiskey before they carried on, because they used to have horrible public hangings in England, as I'm sure they did everywhere, that were like big festival days. Thousands of people would go to watch. It was such an entertainment. Anyway, as I was walking past this church, I had an awareness of every rose in the universe opening. It was very beautiful. The scent was absolutely incredible, and it only lasted for a few minutes. And I was not walking along the street, I was away in that moment. And there's apparently scientific explanations for it, but of course there always is. And the other thing that I experienced was I'd been very close to my grandma. And when she was on her deathbed, you go to say goodbye, and she was lying on the bed, looking like an old lady. And I was in the corner of the room, but then she turned to look at me. And when she turned to look at me, she looked like a 20-year-old girl again. Her hair was blonde, and she looked absolutely beautiful and at peace. And then she turned back, and she was an old lady again. But that is something that I believe other people have experienced. And that was incredibly comforting.
Yeah, I think later, when I started getting more into literature and kind of finding my own way, and started reading books about the great god Pan and fairies and whatnot, I thought, now I finally at least have some sort of lexicon to explain what that encounter was like as a child. And so I've been very reticent to kind of say this is exactly what it is, but those stories have helped me to kind of at least come up with an outline that makes it explainable to others. The
books about fairy stories have a lot of children, being receptive to the influence of fairies. I have a wonderful book. It's a pamphlet written by a nursing sister in the 1950s to raise money I'll send you a picture of the cover, for nurses who didn't have enough money to afford Christmas. I mean, this is in the 1950s. So she's written about fairies in Scotland. And one of her theories, although it's a theory that other people had, is that we lost the ability of having second sight, which I think everybody has, because of education. And so when children were pulled out of the fields for regular learning, that ability to see beyond what's in front of us was lost. And then instead of playing outdoors, they started to be taken to places. And I think she's it's a very good summation, really. So we've lost so much, and the love of nature, you know, understanding why we need nature is part of that vision. So we're letting go, willingly letting go of the magic, the enchantment, and what people don't understand, they ridicule, which is where we're up to now.
Yeah, there's no place in our culture for intuition, really. It all has to fit in these neat categories, which then, you know, transform into things that can be easily marketed and disseminated. And it's all so simplistic. And we've lost that ability to really trust sort of the you know, uneducated or wild part of our minds that we all do share.
Yeah, indeed we do.
Well, anyway, I wanted to thank you for taking the time to do this. It's been incredibly enlightening, and I'm just so happy that I had a chance to interview you and expose people to the work that you've done. I think it's just so beautiful, and I hope you
Thank you.
have the opportunity to write a lot more.